They never wanted her to be part of their family. Not because of who she was, but because of what she looked like. Behind the polite smiles and reluctant congratulations, their disapproval was as heavy as the smoke in the room. But when the bride stepped up to the microphone, head held high, eyes fixed, no one expected what would come next. And when she finished speaking, even those who had judged her were the ones holding back tears. Under the soft light of the high-hanging chandeliers, the classical music hummed like a gentle breath amidst the shimmering scene of a perfect wedding ceremony. White flowers covered both sides of the aisle, interspersed with champagne gold accents, making the space look like a painting painted with love and expectation. The guests murmured, their eyes scanning the room, admiring the exquisite detail. But no one noticed that, at the end of the aisle, a quiet tension was settling over the man in the navy tuxedo. Ethan Miller. He stood straight, his hands clasped in front of him, his lips pressed together in a forced smile. He looked like the perfect groom to anyone who looked at him, so poised, so calm. But his hands were shaking, not because the vows were approaching, not because of fear of a lifetime commitment, but because of the eyes from the first row. Richard and Linda Miller, his parents, sat motionless, their backs as straight as the wooden chairs they occupied. Their faces betrayed nothing, but their bodies betrayed it all. Linda clutched her expensive clutch so tightly her knuckles turned white. Richard clenched his jaw, his eyes sharpening as they passed the woman at the end of the aisle. Jade, the bride of the ceremony. She walked slowly among the white flowers, her father's arm in hers, the soft light reflecting off her honey-brown skin, her hair pulled back to reveal her slender neck. Each step she took was not only toward the man she loved, but also a step straight into the cold hearts of those who had never opened their doors to her. Some of the guests smiled and nodded, appreciating the bride's beauty. But there were also quick, worried glances when their eyes met the frozen eyes of Mr. and Mrs. Miller. In that moment, Ethan knew what he had been trying to hide all this time. He loved her with everything he had, but love hadn't been enough to change their minds. They didn't say it, but every gesture, every frown, every glance said one thing: she didn't belong here. And perhaps if it ended like that, it would remain a beautiful wedding day with a crack that never healed. But little did they know, when Jade stepped up to the microphone, everything would change. Jade walked out from the back of the aisle, her arm tightly wrapped around her father, Mr. Malcolm, the man who had raised her with all the strength and gentleness a father could muster for his daughter. He walked slowly, steadily, as if each step was shielding his daughter from the unwanted gazes ahead. A gentle smile appeared on Jade's lips, the smile that everyone thought was that of a happy bride. But no one heard the soft sigh that passed through her chest, the only thing that revealed that her heart was beating faster, not because of excitement, but because of a deep unease that was seeping through every cell. Ahead, a thin white veil covered her face, but nothing could hide the truth. She knew they didn't want her here, and not because of who she was, but because of what she looked like. Behind her glowing smile, she thought, my heart raced, not with excitement, but with quiet fear. Every step toward the man she loved was a step past judgment. Every cold gaze from the front row was like a knife cutting through the air, piercing through her white dress and straight to her soul. She glanced to her right, an aunt, a close friend from college, smiling genuinely, her eyes sparkling with joy. But then, like a dark cloud passing across the blue sky, her eyes met Linda's, Ethan's mother. Her lips were pressed together, her eyes cold and unfeeling. Beside her, Richard sat silently, but his jaw was clenched, his jaw tight as if he were holding back something that was about to burst forth. They didn't need to say anything, their silence was their verdict. Jade knew it. She'd known it since they'd first met, from the way Linda had smiled politely, but her eyes had scanned her from head to toe as if she were assessing an item of furniture that didn't match her living room. She'd known it since Richard had asked Ethan if he was sure he wanted to go down this path, as if she were a risk, a wrong decision that could stain their family name. But today, even though her heart still fluttered with anxiety, Jade didn't let fear control her anymore. Not on her wedding day, not when she was about to give her life to the man standing at the end of the aisle. his gentle eyes waiting for her as if his entire universe was placed in them. She straightened her back. She squeezed her father's hand a little tighter. Her eyes held a quiet but determined light. If they couldn't see her for who she was, then today she would make it unforgettable. The sound of the music gradually faded, giving way to a sacred silence that enveloped the entire auditorium. All eyes followed the young couple as they stood before each other, hand in hand, only a breath apart. But in their eyes was a lifetime of commitment. Ethan squeezed Jade's hand gently. The look he gave her made everything else melt away. There were no judgmental looks, no cracks in their hearts. There was only her, with her wavy hair swaying in the air-conditioned breeze, her skin as smooth as melted chocolate, and her eyes, the eyes he had fallen in love with the first moment she turned to smile at him in that small bookstore. Ethan took a deep breath, and then he spoke, steady, sincere, each word as if carved from the heart. "Jade, I don't know what I did to deserve you, but every day I get to wake up and call you mine is a day I will protect, honor, and cherish for the rest of my life." No one spoke. But in that moment, the room seemed to freeze. Some people quietly wiped away tears. A few sniffles came from the back. But in the front row, where the parents should have been the first to applaud, there was a heavy silence. Jade looked at Ethan, her eyes watery but determined. Then it was her turn. She took a deep breath, squeezed his hand as if for strength, and spoke. "Ethan, you make the world kinder, simply by being in it. You've taught me that love doesn't have to be enough, it just is. With you, I am home." Applause rang out, sparse at first, then growing into a wave of comfort. But amid the noise, two people remained as still as statues. Richard let out a soft sigh, so soft that no one heard it except Linda, who was clutching the strap of her purse as if to hold back something that was about to break. She glanced at her husband, her eyes flickering with worry, or perhaps disappointment. No one could tell. They both kept their faces impassive, but the truth was, they didn't clap. Ethan, even as he tried to focus on Jade, could feel the silence behind him, and when he turned his head involuntarily, his eyes met his father's. For a split second, he hoped, just once, that his father would smile or simply nod. But Richard looked at him, saw the happiness in his son's eyes, then turned away. It was like the door had closed without a sound. The party was in full swing. Champagne glasses clinked and laughter filled the room, bathed in warm yellow light. But at the main table, the atmosphere was like a thinly stretched string, beautiful, yet terrifyingly fragile. Jade kept smiling, pouring wine, exchanging kind glances with each of Ethan's relatives. But something was stirring inside her, like an undercurrent beneath the calm sea. She saw the averted glances, the smiles that didn't reach the eyes. She sensed the indifference from Richard and Linda's table as they made small talk with everyone, except her. And then, as the music died down, one of the relatives smiled and signaled. "It's time for the bride to speak," he said cheerfully. Jade stood up, no paper in hand, no pre-written speech, just the heart, naked, candid, and honest. She stepped onto the stage, the light illuminating the thin veil still draped over her shoulders, making her look like a flower standing in the sunset, radiant, yet fragile. Jade looked around the room, and finally, her eyes stopped on Richard and Linda. Her voice rang out, soft but firm. "I didn't grow up thinking I'd married into a family that didn't want me, but I did grow up believing that love could change things. Not forcefully, but gently, quietly." The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Ethan sat below, eyes never leaving her. But Jade, she was talking to the only two people who had never really looked at her. "Maybe I wasn't what you expected," she continued, her voice starting to tremble slightly. "But Ethan is exactly the man I prayed for, and I'll spend my life honoring the love he gives so freely." A split second passed. Jade hesitated. Her heart felt like it was about to burst out of her chest, and then, in what could be called the most fragile moment of her life, she laughed, softly, not to hide her tears, but to keep her faith. "You don't have to accept me today," she said, her eyes still where they were. "But I promise, if you ever do, I'll be here, still loving your son, still loving all that he comes with." Applause broke out, this time from all the tables. A few people stood up, their eyes red, but Richard remained where he was, leaning forward, as if contemplating something too deep to say. Linda turned away, but not fast enough to hide the tear that escaped her eye. As applause scattered across the room, Linda's expression remained unchanged. She sat up straight, her hand still resting lightly on her purse, her eyes trying to maintain their usual calm. But inside, a crack was quietly spreading beneath the surface of the proud shell she had maintained for so many years. Jade's words kept repeating silently in her head. I didn't grow up thinking I'd marry into a family that didn't want me, like an echo that wouldn't go away. And strangely enough, it didn't make her angry. It made her remember. Remembering a young girl from years ago, her hair still curled in the 80s style, her wedding dress hugging her slim figure, her hands shaking as she stood before her future mother-in-law, who looked at her with the same eyes she had just given Jade. Linda was not accepted that day either. Even though she loved Richard with all her youth, with all the sleepless nights waiting for him to finish his boarding school shift to his family, she was still an ordinary girl from a very simple family. They never said it, but Linda never needed them to say it. Just the way they kept silent when she spoke, the polite nod that never lasted more than 3 seconds, it was enough. And she used to think, if I love enough, I will be recognized. She proved herself little by little, from the perfect dinners to the way she cared for Richard through his illness. But what tired her most was not his family's judgment, but her own, who kept trying to be the kind of daughter-in-law they expected. And now as Jade stood there, not trying to please anyone, just standing there with all the sincerity of someone who loved Ethan and dared to speak the truth, Linda saw in herself something she had never had the courage to do. Dare not ask for permission to exist. She looked at Jade again. No longer an outsider, no longer an intruder into a family, but a girl who was rewriting the things Linda herself had wished she could change but had never had the courage to. And perhaps what made Linda choke up the most was not that Jade had just reminded her of her old wound, but that she could not deny that. She had become the one who caused that wound to someone else. Jade walked off the stage to a thunderous applause, but it was the silence that followed that was memorable. Ethan waited at the foot of the steps, his eyes following her, as if each step she took rewrote the definition of courage and dignity. He reached out, and when Jade placed her hand in it, no one saw, but she felt that he squeezed her hand, not as a formality, but as a silent thank you. An unspoken promise, I see you. I'm proud of you. Amidst the warm yellow light and the bewildered gazes, the two of them stood side by side, as if the world had finally taken a step back to acknowledge that love was real, not fake, not in need of approval. It existed on its own, strong enough to overcome prejudice. From the front row, Richard leaned forward, his voice low and hoarse, as if each word had to be drawn up from the very thing he had tried to bury. We were wrong. Wrong for a long time. Miss Linda said nothing. She was still watching the couple, but her gaze had changed. No longer stern, no longer suspicious, just quiet observation, as if Jade had awakened something long dormant in her. Back then, she herself had been opposed by her husband's family. She had stood in her wedding dress, trembling as she walked under the scrutiny. She had also thought that if she loved deeply enough, she would be accepted. And now, when she looked at Jade, a girl who had overcome the loneliness of the gaze, stepping onto the stage with a bare heart, Linda realized she was on the other side of memory, and she herself was repeating the wound that she had cried silently for in the past. She swallowed. The veneer of pride that had adorned her face was gone. She looked at Jade, no longer as an outsider, but as the girl her son had chosen, loved, and most importantly, someone she could no longer help but see with all the truth in her heart. The light in the room was no longer cold as glass. It softened, illuminating the things that were quietly transforming. And for Linda, it was a moment when prejudice had no voice, and only love. Late, but enough to begin. As Jade stepped off the stage with Ethan, the light from the tall chandeliers cast soft shadows across her white veil, as if the room were holding its breath as it waited for something to settle. Each step she took them not only away from the stage, but also away from the long distance that had separated her from his family. Ethan leaned toward her, his fingers entwining with hers, without a word. His squeeze wasn't a social gesture reserved for crowds. It was a warm breeze, A wordless promise. You're not alone, you've changed everything, and I've seen it all. And then, something happened that seemed natural. Jade turned around, not to look for anyone, but because a gentle feeling in her heart made her gaze stop on the second row, where Linda sat silently. No amount of carefully applied makeup could hide that gaze. A gaze that was no longer one of denial nor of defense. It was just a recognition. Linda looked at Jade, for the first time not with searching eyes but with a fragile light, as if in the young woman she saw a forgotten version of herself, brave yet yearning for recognition. Then she nodded slightly, just slightly, but clearly. As if in that look and nod, Linda was whispering, "You don't need to be anyone else. I've seen enough." No one in the audience noticed, but for Jade, that moment was like a thread that quietly connected two generations, two wounds, not to erase the past, but to start something else, healing. The music began softly. The first melody lingered as if calling the silent cracks in the hearts of each attendee back to a single moment where there was only soft light, breathing, and forgiveness slowly forming. Ethan held out his hand, Jade put hers in it, and for a moment the room faded. Gone were the perfectly arranged chairs, gone were the cold looks and forced greetings. There was only them, he and she, together in the tiny universe created by their love. He spun her gently, the smile in their eyes clear, without needing to speak. She didn't dance with the hesitation of someone newly accepted, but with the stride of someone who knew she deserved to be here, from the start. From a distance, Richard watched silently. Linda sat next to him, her hand clasped in his. No one spoke, but in that silence, something greater than any apology was happening. Repentance. It was no longer two parents trying to hold on to the old image of the family they thought their son should have. It was two people learning to look again and let go. And then, Jade turned. In a split second mid-dance, she saw them, no longer avoiding their eyes, no longer trying to smile to please anyone. It was just her, whole, gentle, and they saw it. Life never begins when everything is perfect. It begins when we dare to forgive, dare to look back, and dare to open our hearts, even when our hearts are still trembling. And sometimes, what we think is loss is the door that leads us closer to ourselves.